All right, let's jump right in. Think about this for a second. What if I told you that one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, a guy who literally changed the game for modern literature, believed that great poetry has almost nothing to do with the poet's personal feelings? I know, it's a wild idea. It goes against everything we think we know about art being about self-expression. Well, that poet was T.S. Eliot.
And there it is, straight from the man himself. An escape from emotion? An escape from personality? How can that possibly be? Isn't poetry supposed to be about, pouring your heart out onto the page? Well, to really wrap our heads around this mind-bending concept, we have to understand the man who came up with it.
Because T.S. Eliot wasn't just some writer, he was an absolute giant, a cultural force of nature and a key figure in the Modernist movement who basically rewrote the rules for everyone, poets, critics, and even us the readers. I mean, just look at this trajectory. From his revolutionary debut with proof rock, to the cultural earthquake that was The Wasteland, all the way to a Nobel Prize. Eliot's career was just one huge masterclass in literary authority. He wasn't just part of the conversation. For a few decades there, he pretty much was the conversation. And his influence was everywhere. Of course, he was an incredibly powerful poet and a successful playwright. But, and this is so important, he was also one of the most respected and feared critics of his time. His essays like Tradition and the Individual Talent weren't just his opinions. No, they were manifestos that created a whole new way of thinking about what literature is and what it should do. Now, to really get how massive Eliot's revolution was, we have to look at what he was pushing back against. And he was fighting against an idea of poetry that had completely dominated the art form for over 100 years. This is the idea we're all familiar with, right? It comes from the Romantic poets, guys like Wordsworth. It's this vision of the poet as this super-sensitive soul whose private feelings and unique personal experiences are the very heart of their art. The more personal it is, the more authentic it is. This chart just lays out the battle lines perfectly. On one side, you've got Romanticism, all about the poet's personality, those spontaneous feelings, and the ultimate goal of self-expression. And then you've got Eliot's Modernism, which flips the whole thing on its head. The focus is now the poem itself, the source is intellectual craft, and the goal, that radical idea, an escape from personality. So how on earth did Eliot propose we make this escape? Well, his first big move was to completely redefine the word tradition. He breaks it all down in that huge essay of his, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Okay, this is the key. For Eliot, tradition isn't something you just get, like inheriting your grandpa's old watch. It's not about just liking old books or copying the past. Nope. It's an active, conscious, and really, really difficult process. It's something you have to work for, something you have to earn. And the main tool for this hard labor is what he calls the historical sense. This is not about memorizing dates and authors for a test. It's about being able to feel the entire history of European literature, from Homer all the way up to today, all at once. Like it's a living, breathing thing that's right there in the room with you as you write. So you see, for Eliot, tradition isn't some static museum. It's a dynamic, living system. When a truly great new poem comes along, it doesn't just get tacked on to the end of the line. It actually sends a ripple backward through time, and it subtly changes how we understand all the great works that came before it. The past shapes the present, sure, but the present also reshapes the past. And this leads us to Eliot's most famous, and maybe his weirdest idea, his theory of impersonality. And to explain it, he uses this brilliant metaphor that comes straight out of a chemistry lab. Okay, so first, picture the poet's mind. It's not the main show. It's more like a catalyst, he says, like a little shred of platinum. It's totally necessary to make a reaction happen, but it doesn't actually become part of the final result. Next, you need your raw materials. These are the feelings, emotions, and experiences of the person who happens to be the poet. Let's think of them as the gases in our experiment, say oxygen and sulfur dioxide. They're essential for anything to happen. And here is where the magic happens. When those emotions, the chemicals, are processed in the presence of that catalyst, the poet's mind, which has that hard-won historical sense, they combine and form something totally new, the poem. But here's the crucial part. The catalyst, the poet's actual personality, is left behind. It's separate, neutral, and totally unchanged by the whole process. The poem isn't the poet's emotion. It's a new thing made from that emotion. So the logical conclusion from all this is, well, it's profound. If the poet's personality isn't actually in the poem, then it's a waste of time to analyze the art by digging into the artist's life. We shouldn't care what the poet meant to do or what was happening in their biography. We should just focus on the words on the page. Period. Now, you can imagine these ideas were absolute bombshells. They kicked off entire schools of thought and basically ran literary studies for 50 years. But today, that legacy is a lot more complicated and faces some very real, very valid criticism.
On the one hand, his influence is undeniable. His ideas led directly to the New Criticism movement, which took over how literature was taught. Seriously, if you ever had an English class where the teacher said, forget about the author's life, just focus on the text itself, themes, symbols, structure, that is the direct legacy of T.S. Eliot. But on the other hand, this way of thinking is now heavily critiqued. His idea of tradition is often called out for being Eurocentric and pretty elitist, and his whole theory of impersonality seems to dismiss incredibly powerful forms of art, like confessional poetry or protest poetry, which get their power precisely from the author's personal identity and experience. So that leaves us with a really interesting question for right now. In our world, a world that is just saturated with personal brands, confessional TikToks, and endless self-expression online, what are we supposed to make of Eliot's call to escape from personality? Is it just an outdated, snobby idea, or is the discipline of creating something that is separate from yourself a kind of lost art, one that we might need now more than ever? It's a tough question from a poet who always loved a good challenge.